Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we unpack fascinating sources to give you a true shortcut to being well informed. Today, we're embarking on a journey right into the heart of artificial intelligence, and we're going to challenge, well, one of the most fundamental assumptions about its future. When you think about truly powerful AI systems, what comes to mind? For many of us, it's probably this picture of gargantuan, incredibly expensive models, right? Built and owned by just a handful of tech behemoths like Google or OpenAI. We imagine these AIs needing just mind-boggling amounts of computing power to train, let alone to actually run. The prevailing intuition, the narrative we often hear, is that the biggest, the most resource-intensive models will always reign supreme, dominating the entire AI landscape. It feels like an arms race, ever larger, ever more costly machines. But what if that intuition, that commonly held belief, is actually, well, maybe a mirage? What if the future of AI isn't this endless race for sheer size and computational brute force, but rather a surprising shift?
A shift towards smaller, much more accessible models that can achieve comparable, maybe even virtually indistinguishable performance. That's the truly counterintuitive idea we're diving into today. Our mission in this deep dive is to really unpack this transformative concept. We're going to explore why these Meek models, as they're provocatively called, might become, well, astonishingly powerful, and what the profound implications of this convergence are for society, for strategic planning and business and government, and, for global policy. Get ready to have your perspective on AI's future maybe dramatically expanded. Our primary source for this deep dive is a groundbreaking academic paper. It's titled Meek Models Shall Inherit the Earth, authored by Hans Gunlock, Jason Lynch, and Neil Thompson from MIT CSAIL. So yeah, we're digging into serious cutting-edge research here, and we promise to make it incredibly compelling for you.
Okay, so let's set the stage a bit. For the last decade, we've witnessed this absolutely incredible trend in the world of AI. Systems growing exponentially in capability, largely driven by just a few massive corporations.
When you think about cutting-edge AI, you immediately think of the big names models, like GPT, Llama, Gemini. These aren't just names. They represent this immense concentration of power and resources. So given this rapid centralization, what does this look like on the ground right now? What are the tangible effects of this kind of dominance on who can access and develop advanced AI?
Yeah, it's truly fascinating and a bit concerning, actually, how quickly these large corporations have come to dominate the entire life cycle of state-of-the-art or SOTA models. It's not just about the immense financial and computational resources required to train these models, which, let's be honest, is already a massive barrier to entry for most. We're also seeing that it's getting progressively harder to even run inference on these systems, just to use them. The largest models often demand multiple high-end GPUs, putting them effectively out of reach for many individuals, startups, or even mid-sized organizations. So this concentration of power, both in training and deployment, it really raises some important questions about access and control. It's creating a landscape that, well, it almost mirrors the early days of computing, where powerful mainframes were only accessible to large institutions.
That's a critical observation. So if this trend just continues uninterrupted, what are the most immediate concerns? What kind of future does this imply for AI access and innovation? Could we genuinely be heading towards, like, an AI oligarchy, where cutting-edge capabilities are locked within a very small, exclusive club?
Indeed, that's a valid and, frankly, deeply concerning possibility. It's something that sources like Cartier et al. Explicitly raise. If the current trajectory of investment and scaling continues unchecked, it strongly suggests a future where access to advanced AI capabilities becomes highly restricted, basically creating a powerful bottleneck. Imagine a world where only a privileged few can harness the true power of AI, while everyone else is left using much less capable, maybe even outdated systems. And this isn't just about economic power. It's about control over information, over innovation, and ultimately over societal direction. However, this is precisely where our deep dive gets really interesting, because at the same time, other sources like Lone and Liu have begun to warn about a phenomenon that's almost contradictory to this trend. They're talking about diminishing returns to AI scaling.
Diminishing returns.
Yeah, they're raising speculation that AI might actually be hitting a wall in terms of how much performance gain you get from increasingly massive investments. So this tension between continued centralization and the whisper of diminishing returns is the core of what we're exploring today.
Right, because we hear so much about the race for bigger, more powerful AI models. But this paper presents this truly counterintuitive idea that challenges that whole notion. Can you unpack what that idea is and what it suggests about the future performance of AI models, especially for those with more limited resources?
This is really the crux of the paper's argument, and it's potentially a game changer. It posits that performance levels in AI could actually converge. What this means is that models trained or run with limited resources, what the paper calls Meek models, will achieve performance levels remarkably comparable, maybe even indistinguishable, from the current state-of-the-art models built with exponentially larger budgets.
Wow. So, comparable performance without the massive cost.
Think about that for a moment. You might not need a multi-billion-dollar supercomputer to access capabilities that are virtually identical to what those colossal systems offer. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it suggests a potential for a far greater democratization of AI systems. Instead of an AI oligarchy, we could move towards a world where advanced AI capabilities are widely accessible, a world where these Meek models could truly inherit the earth, empowering individuals, smaller companies, even nonprofits in ways we currently only imagine.
So for you, the listener, this means the barrier to entry for leveraging cutting-edge AI could just drop dramatically.
Exactly, opening up entirely new avenues for creativity, research, and problem solving.
All right, so how do they model this convergence? What's the core mechanism at play here? It sounds like there's some serious but maybe elegant math behind this counterintuitive conclusion.
There is, and it's actually quite elegant in its simplicity. The paper constructs a model that really zeroes in on the difference in training loss between these state-of-the-art SOTA models, which are characterized by exponentially growing compute budgets, and a Meek model. And this Meek model, for contrast, operates with a fixed, modest budget. For instance, they use a benchmark budget of around $1,000.
$1,000. That seems tiny compared to the billions we hear about.
It is, and that $1,000 translates roughly to about 10 to the 17 GPU flops per dollar, just to give a sense of scale. Now, when we talk about loss, you can think of it as how surprised the AI model is by the next piece of information it sees.
Okay, like how well it predicts the next word.
Precisely. The lower the loss, the less surprised it is, meaning it's incredibly good at predicting, almost like it knows what's coming next. So when we say models converge in loss, we mean they become almost equally good at predicting. They become almost indistinguishable in their core understanding of the data they were trained on. The foundational assumption here is that scaling performance is governed by what are known as chinchilla-like scaling laws.
Ah, the chinchilla paper, right. That made some waves.
It really did. These chinchilla laws are significant because they essentially showed us the recipe for optimal AI training. They proved that simply throwing more compute at a model isn't enough. You need to balance compute with the right amount of data. And critically, they revealed that as you get better, each additional bit of compute gives you less and less gain. That's the core of diminishing returns.
Got it.
So in essence, they're comparing a giant with an ever-expanding wallet to a very efficient fixed-budget player, both operating under the same fundamental rules of performance scaling and facing the same diminishing returns.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like two cars on a track, maybe. One has an unlimited fuel budget, the other has a very small fixed amount. But crucially, both cars are getting better engines and more aerodynamic designs over time, right? What are the actual forces that contribute to this effective compute for both models? It's not just about throwing more money at it. There must be other factors at play that level the field over time, even for the Meek model.
Exactly. You've hit on a crucial point there. It's a combination of powerful compounding trends that benefit both the SOTA models and the Meek ones. They make every dollar of compute go further for everyone involved. First, we have hardware capability growth. This is largely driven by trends similar to Moore's law, where the density of transistors doubles roughly every 2 years.
Okay, the standard hardware improvement curve.
Right. The paper models this hardware growth, they call it JAV, at approximately 1.4 times per year. So your foundational compute power per dollar is steadily increasing for everyone, regardless of budget. That's the underlying engine of progress. Second, and this is really crucial, there's algorithmic progress. This isn't about faster chips, but about smarter, more efficient ways to train models.
Like the transformer architecture itself.
Exactly. It's about innovations that make it possible to learn more effectively with less computation. Think of the revolutionary impact of transformers, which dramatically improved how language models are trained and enabled entirely new architectures. Research by Howard et al. Found that in language models, algorithmic progress, GALG, is remarkably rapid and consistent over time. It effectively doubles the computational resources you get from a given budget every 8 months.
Every 8 months. Wow.
Yeah, that's about 2.8 times per year. This means the efficiency of learning is just skyrocketing, making every dollar of compute go much, much further. And this benefits both the massive models and the modest ones.
So hardware is growing, algorithms are getting smarter. Those are shared benefits that lift all boats, as they say. But what about the actual investment by these big companies? They're clearly still pouring vast sums of money into this. How does that factor into the overall effective compute, especially for the SOTA models, and how does it play against those shared benefits?
That's the third factor: growth in compute investment. This is where the SOTA models truly differentiate themselves in terms of sheer scale and where their unique advantage lies, at least for a period. Between 2010 and 2022, the compute used for training deep learning models by the largest players grew at an astonishing rate by a factor of 5 yearly.
5 times a year.
Incredible, right?
Yeah.
When you factor in the hardware growth we just discussed, the effective compute investment, Burley, is still a substantial 3.57 times per year. So the SOTA models are benefiting from faster hardware, smarter algorithms, and exponentially increasing capital investment. The Meek model, by contrast, only benefits from the hardware and algorithmic progress because its capital budget remains fixed. It's this interplay of exponential capital invested against the universal diminishing returns and those shared algorithmic and hardware gains that creates the fascinating dynamic the paper explores.
Okay, so you've got this SOTA model scaling exponentially with all 3 factors, and a Meek model with a fixed budget that's still benefiting from hardware and algorithmic progress. Definitely sounds like a race. Where does the magic happen that makes them converge? How does the Meek model, despite its fixed budget, eventually catch up to a significant degree, rather than just falling further and further behind?
This is where the concept of the inflection point becomes absolutely critical. If you imagine a graph in your mind, on the y-axis, you have the performance gap between the SOTA model and the Meek model. On the x-axis, you have time.
Okay.
Initially, the model with the exponentially growing compute budget, or SOTA model, is able to far surpass the Meek model. It gains a significant advantage in terms of lower training loss and higher capabilities. That gap widens. However, at a critical point in time, this gap between them eventually stops widening and actually starts to decline.
It starts closing again. How?
What happens is that the diminishing returns to compute scale, which are inherent in those chinchilla-like scaling laws we mentioned, combined with the exponential growth in the shared factors, the algorithmic and hardware progress, they simply overwhelm the advantage gained from just throwing more money and exponentially growing compute budget at the problem. From that inflection point onward, even massive, continually increasing investments by the SOTA model builders yield only a very narrow, increasingly marginal loss advantage over models trained with a very modest fixed budget.
So the extra billions buy less and less of an edge.
Precisely. It's like trying to get an extra fraction of a percentage point of accuracy out of a model that's already performing at, say, 99.9%. The effort required for that tiny improvement becomes astronomical, and the difference becomes barely noticeable to a human observer or even for many practical applications. To give you an illustrative example from the paper, if we take the GPT-2 baseline from 2019, which cost maybe $25,000 to $50,000 to train.
We're seeing huge then.
Right. Well, the model predicts a peak SOTA advantage in the early to mid-2020s over models with that kind of training budget. This means models trained for around that cost, benefiting from the subsequent algorithmic and hardware advancements, would then begin to close the gap on the ever larger SOTA models being built today.
Okay, so the inflection point for that level of meekness is around now or very soon.
Exactly. And if the Meek model budget is even smaller, say just $1,000, then the inflection point would have occurred even earlier, perhaps around 2017. What's also compelling is that even under older pre-chinchilla scaling laws, where diminishing returns were considered less steep, the inflection time is still about 10 years.
So it's a robust finding.
It suggests the core conclusion about convergence is quite robust, yeah. It seems to hold true even with significant variations in the parameters. It's not some fragile prediction. It looks like a fundamental consequence of these scaling laws and maybe the nature of intelligence itself, at least when it's primarily built on statistical prediction of existing data.
Okay, when we talk about loss, it still sounds incredibly technical, almost abstract. As a listener, I primarily care about what the model can actually do in the real world. How does this loss difference, this very technical metric, connect to real-world capabilities and how useful an AI model truly is? Because for many people, lower loss doesn't automatically translate to higher intelligence or better performance in tasks they actually care about.
That's an excellent question, and it's definitely something the paper thoughtfully addresses. Model loss is a technical measure, no doubt. For language models, it quantifies how well a model predicts the data it was trained on, essentially how efficiently it can encode text. Think of it as how precisely the model can anticipate the next word in a sentence, or maybe the next pixel in an image if it were a vision model. Traditionally, language model loss is expressed as the average negative log likelihood per token, or sometimes as perplexity, which is related exponentially. A difference in loss, say L1, L2 equals UAL, quantifies how many extra bits of information per token one model needs to encode text compared to another. And historically, deep learning progress has tracked decreasing loss quite reliably. For instance, GPT-3's loss is demonstrably lower than GPT-2's, and that decrease clearly correlated with significant advancements in capabilities generating more coherent text, answering more complex questions, and so on. So there's a strong empirical link there.
But is loss always a direct, perfect proxy for intelligence or general capabilities?
Oh.
Are there nuances we should be aware of, especially when we start talking about highly complex or novel tasks, or even when the model starts doing things beyond just predicting text?
Not always directly, no. And this is a crucial nuance. The paper speculates that most model capabilities are monotonic functions of loss, meaning better loss generally does mean better capability. Things improve smoothly as loss goes down. However, some capabilities might appear as abrupt discontinuities. Imagine a small improvement in loss suddenly unlocks a completely new skill set.
Like learning arithmetic.
Exactly. A tiny improvement in a model's ability to predict mathematical symbols might suddenly enable it to solve complex algebra problems it couldn't touch before. That wouldn't look like a smooth improvement. Furthermore, in less defined or more competitive settings, loss difference might not fully capture the real-world performance difference. We'll touch on that later when we discuss alternative futures. But it's worth noting that even for vision transformers and image classification, accuracy follows a remarkably similar power law form to log likelihood loss. This suggests the relationship between raw loss and practical performance is quite widespread across different AI domains, reinforcing the general applicability of these scaling laws.
So how do we bridge that gap? How do we get from a purely technical loss score to something more tangible, something like how well an AI performs on a standardized test, or a real-world task like summarizing a document or answering complex questions? Because that's what truly matters to the end user, to us.
Right, we need a bridge. We can use established benchmarks as a proxy for this translation. The paper, for example, examines the relationship between LLM loss and standard, widely recognized benchmarks like MMLU.
MMLU, that's the Massive Multitask Language Understanding Benchmark?
That's the one. It evaluates an AI's knowledge and problem-solving abilities across like 57 different subjects: history, law, math, you name it. It's a pretty comprehensive test. Other work showed that MMLU performance can be quite accurately modeled as a sigmoid function of training compute.
A sigmoid. Like an S-curve.
Exactly. It means you see slow progress initially, then rapid improvements as compute increases, and finally saturation as the model approaches peak performance on that specific benchmark. It plateaus. Since loss is inversely related to compute, meaning lower loss correlates with more compute, we can effectively translate this sigmoid relationship from compute to loss.
Okay, so performance rises quickly, then levels off as loss decreases.
Correct. Imagine that S-shaped curve, initially flat, then rising steeply, and finally flattening out again. That's the dynamic we're talking about for MMLU performance as loss decreases. The paper presents an updated sigmoid fit of MMLU scores directly to loss, providing a clear visual representation of this link. And the dynamics of this sigmoid translated loss reveal a pattern remarkably similar to the training loss convergence we discussed earlier. Initially, there's little difference in benchmark capabilities between the SOTA and Meek models. Then, as the SOTA model rapidly scales, a large difference emerges, reflecting its significant advantage in tackling these complex tasks. But critically, this is followed by an eventual convergence in benchmark performance between the SOTA and the Meek models.
So even on the benchmarks, the gap closes.
Exactly. This signifies that even on practical, multifaceted tasks like MMLU, the performance gap is predicted to narrow significantly over time. It suggests that even on a standardized IQ test for AI, the smaller, more accessible models will eventually catch up.
That's fascinating. But what if a task isn't just one simple question or a single benchmark, but requires multiple steps or like chained reasoning? Solving a complex problem that needs several correct sub-answers in sequence or engaging in a multi-turn conversation to get to a final conclusion.
Does that change anything about the convergence timeline or the advantage a large model might have?
It absolutely does, and this is where it gets particularly interesting for our listener, especially when thinking about highly complex or critical applications. The paper considers tasks that require P steps, where each step necessitates correct, zero-shot benchmark performance.
Zero shot meaning it can do it without specific training for that exact step.
Precisely. It's like asking a human a brand new question, and they can figure it out using general knowledge without prior coaching on that specific question. Very important capability. So, if a task needs, say, 2 correct zero-shot MMLU answers in a row, the probability of success is the MMLU score squared. Small errors compound quickly. As the paper illustrates, if you were to visualize this, as the number of necessary tasks or steps P increases, so does the length of time that large model builders retain a significant advantage.
Okay, so for really complex multi-step things, the big models stay ahead for longer.
Yes, exactly. Because any small error in an intermediate step gets magnified. The SOTA models, having slightly lower error rates per step, are much more likely to complete the whole chain successfully. However, what's equally important is that the maximum loss difference needed to be superior at these multi-step tasks also decreases as P increases.
Wait, the maximum difference decreases. Why?
It's a bit counterintuitive, but it's partly due to the specific MMLU benchmark and its observed performance ceiling in the data they used, which didn't exceed 80%. This means a P-level task can't exceed 0.8 P in performance. So as P gets larger, the maximum possible score gets very small, meaning the absolute difference between models also has to shrink. For tasks that could potentially achieve higher accuracy, this effect would be less pronounced. But the core insight remains. Even for multi-step reasoning, convergence is still predicted. It just might take longer for the Meek models to fully catch up on those really hard sequential problems.
It's a delay, not a permanent block on convergence.
Exactly. A longer period of SOTA advantage, but not an infinite one.
That's a very practical way to think about it. What about a more theoretical way, like an information theoretical way of thinking about this difference? Not just benchmarks, but how genuinely distinguishable these models are from each other at a fundamental level. As in, if I were just looking at their output, how many examples would I need to see before I could definitively say one is better than the other?
Yeah, the paper offers an elegant information theory-based perspective on this, building on some earlier work. Imagine you have 2 models, Model A and Model B, and both are trying to predict human text. The core question becomes, how many tokens, how much text, does an ideal observer need to reliably distinguish which model is actually better? This is crucial because as the loss difference between models decreases, as they get closer in performance, the number of tokens necessary to tell them apart increases exponentially.
Exponentially, so it gets very hard, very fast to tell them apart.
Extremely hard. Picture this. Initially, when the SOTA model has a large loss advantage, maybe you only need to see a few sentences, a few hundred tokens, to differentiate it from the Meek model. It's clear which one is superior. But as the SOTA and Meek models become more indistinguishable due to convergence, the number of tokens required to reliably differentiate them grows dramatically. You might need to observe them generating massive amounts of text, millions, maybe even billions of tokens, to confidently say one is definitively statistically better than the other.
Wow. So for all practical purposes, they become identical.
For many real-world uses, yes. The difference might simply become imperceptible to the average user, or even to sophisticated analyses without enormous amounts of data. This strong exponential relationship powerfully supports the convergence conclusion across different analytical approaches. It moves beyond just empirical benchmarks into a more fundamental theoretical understanding of model capabilities.
Okay, we've been talking a lot about training models and the immense compute power required for that. But what about actually using them? For most of us, we don't train our own models. We just want to run inference on a powerful one, whether it's through an API or maybe eventually on our own device. Is that where the new battleground for AI power is emerging? And does it accelerate this convergence even further?
You're absolutely right, and this is a major shift that significantly impacts our discussion. We are definitely in the middle of a profound transition. We're shifting from primarily scaling training compute to primarily scaling inference computation.
So making them cheaper and faster to run.
Exactly. This is a huge paradigm shift for the industry. The critical question for our deep dive, then, is whether this new paradigm will also yield the same diminishing returns as pre-training compute. And the answer, under a popular model often cited, is yes. Inference compute can actually substitute for and multiply training compute.
Substitute for training compute, how does that work?
Well, what this means, hypothetically, is that doubling training compute while having inference compute could lead to the same effective performance level. Or, more relevantly, making inference much more efficient is like getting the performance of a model trained with much more compute.
Ah, I see. So efficiency in running, it boosts its apparent power.
Precisely. Therefore, exponentially increasing inference compute efficiency for a given task leads to similar diminishing returns in terms of loss and benchmark performance, just like training compute does. It's a very powerful equivalency that profoundly impacts accessibility and the timeline of convergence.
So what does a Meek user with a fixed inference budget look like in this scenario? Say they're aiming for a cost of, I don't know, 10 to the minus $8 per token, which is a tiny fraction of a cent. How does their effective model size increase over time, allowing them to gain access to SOTA capabilities, even if they aren't paying more money?
Yeah, for a user with a fixed inference budget, the effective model size they can run, and thus the capabilities they can access, increases dramatically over time, even if their actual dollar spend remains constant. This is due to a confluence of several powerful factors. First, you have the improvements in flops per dollar, which is our familiar Moore's law. Chips get cheaper and more powerful.
Okay, the hardware part again.
Right. Second, there are innovations in how many parameters can be executed per flop. Think of highly optimized techniques like KV caching or sparse attention, which allow more model work to be done with the same raw compute by making operations more efficient, basically using the hardware smarter. And finally, there are improvements in effective parameters per actual parameters. This comes from advancements like speculative sampling.
Speculative sampling. What's that?
Oh, it's clever. It's where a smaller, faster model generates most of the output, and a larger, more powerful but slower model just quickly checks and corrects it if needed. Saves a lot of compute on the easy parts.
Okay.
Or techniques like distillation, where a large model teaches a smaller one to mimic its behavior, or just general algorithmic progress that makes each parameter in a model inherently more efficient. So it's not just cheaper chips. It's also smarter ways to use those chips to execute more complex models effectively. It makes every dollar and every computational cycle work much harder. While the exact rate of algorithmic progress in LLM inference, let's call it GINF, is still an open question, the paper uses a conservative estimate of a 9x cost reduction per year.
9 times cheaper per year.
Based on observed trends, yeah. It's a truly staggering rate of improvement. It means the effective model size you can run with a fixed budget increases 9-fold annually. This is crucial because the performance of a model generally depends on its effective size and how much compute it effectively leverages.
Wait, 9 times cheaper per year? That sounds incredibly powerful for a Meek user. That's not just incremental improvement. That's exponential democratization of access. It sounds like you could start with a modest computer today, and in just a few years, it could effectively run capabilities that cost millions or billions to train initially.
It absolutely is. The formula for Meek inference loss demonstrates the extremely strong effect of these continuous improvements. Consider this. If a user can cut inference costs by a factor of 10 through these advancements, they can effectively run a model that is 10 times larger in terms of parameters. But what's truly mind-boggling is that this 10x larger model corresponds to a model that was trained with 100 times the compute of a smaller model. Roughly, yes, due to the scaling laws. This nonlinear relationship between inference efficiency and effective training compute is what rapidly accelerates the convergence. The fascinating implication is that eventually a user with a fixed, modest inference budget can effectively run the largest SOTA model. At that point, they can't gain further loss performance benefits because they're already running the best possible model available. The bottleneck shifts from compute cost to the inherent limits of the best model itself.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, the convergence we talked about for models and training, where the Meek models eventually catch up, actually happens even faster when we consider the incredible efficiency gains in inference. This suggests that the practical benefits of SOTA AI could become widespread much sooner than many people anticipate.
Precisely. You've got it exactly right. Imagine 2 lines on a graph, both dropping over time, representing the performance gap. The inference convergence line plummets much more steeply than the training convergence line. That's what the paper dramatically illustrates in one of its figures. The loss difference under the inference model shows a much quicker and steeper drop compared to the training loss difference model. This strongly implies that the accessibility of SOTA capabilities might arrive sooner through efficient inference than through individual training efforts, even for those with limited capital.
That makes sense. It's easier to benefit from someone else's efficient inference than to train your own giant model.
Exactly. And this also leads to some interesting predictions. For instance, it suggests an increased usage of techniques like that speculative sampling we mentioned. As models of different sizes become nearly indistinguishable on most common tokens or tasks, these efficiency-driven methods become incredibly valuable. They drive the cost down further and reinforce this convergence. It's kind of a race to the bottom on cost, but in a good way, for access to capabilities.
This all sounds incredibly compelling in theory, with all these models and predictions, but what does the actual data show? What about AI inequality out there in the real world? Are we seeing any empirical evidence that supports this idea of Meek models catching up, or is it still just a theoretical prediction?
Yeah, good question. The empirical data is still somewhat sparse, as this is such a rapidly evolving field, but it's largely suggestive and seems to align well with the model's predictions, particularly for inference. Our sources cite data from the Artificial Analysis LLM Leaderboard, which tracks the performance of commercially available LLMs. This is a great real-world test case. Even though the best commercial systems typically leverage higher inference costs for more extensive reasoning and maybe some complex prompting techniques, meaning they're optimized for top performance, not necessarily lowest cost. The data reveals a remarkable convergence of model capabilities.
Convergence even among the commercial leaders.
Yes. You see many different models from different companies, often with different architectures, all achieving remarkably similar high scores on common benchmarks. It's getting crowded at the top. This lines up exceedingly well with the fast convergence predicted by the zero-shot inference advantage model we discussed. It mirrors that rapid closing of the gap we saw in the theoretical graph.
So the real world is already reflecting this idea of Meek models catching up, at least for inference. That's powerful confirmation. What about the training side of things? Is there similar empirical evidence for that, or is it harder to track?
Yes, for inference, the evidence seems quite compelling, largely due to that rapid algorithmic progress in inference and the compounding growth in inference computation. For training compute, though, well, where we often use parameter count as a rough proxy for total training compute, the data is more inconclusive.
Why is it trickier there?
Well, a few reasons. First, measuring the actual training compute for private cutting-edge models is notoriously hard. Companies are understandably secretive about these huge investments.
Like trade secrets.
Exactly. Plus, the field is evolving so fast. New techniques like distillation mean a smaller model can sometimes perform like a much larger one, making direct comparisons based on raw compute or parameter count less straightforward. It's like trying to compare cars based only on engine size when one might have revolutionary aerodynamics or a super efficient hybrid engine.
Gotcha. Parameter count isn't the whole story.
Not anymore, necessarily. Furthermore, parameter counts are often only available for open source models, which creates a significant data blind spot for the most advanced closed source systems where the biggest compute investments are happening.
Okay, that makes sense. Any specific examples from the data that are maybe tricky to square with the model? Things that present a bit of an anomaly or suggest areas for future research?
Indeed. While the predicted inflection point for, say, 7 billion parameter models, which were considered SOTA around 2023, is expected sometime around 2027 based on the model. And this aligns reasonably well with current gaps on benchmarks like MMLU Pro. There's a particular observation that stands out. The largest observed gap in MMLU Pro scores seen between 2023 and 2024, as shown in the empirical data, falls somewhat outside the range predicted by the training-based model if that gap represents a genuine long-term trend and not just a temporary fluctuation.
So a potential discrepancy there.
A potential one, yeah. It highlights the dynamic nature of the field and the need for continued meticulous observation. The models are powerful predictive tools, but the real world always throws new data points at us that keep us on our toes and push the research forward. It serves as a good reminder that while the underlying scaling laws seem robust, their interaction with the ever-changing landscape of AI development, new architectures, new training techniques can produce unexpected short-term fluctuations.
Okay, this entire framework we've discussed is based on the premise that models are growing increasingly close to the fixed distribution of human text, basically mastering everything there is to learn from it. But what if AI isn't just about imitating humans? What if it learns entirely new skills or is trained in new, fundamentally different ways, moving beyond mimicking our data? Could that break the convergence pattern?
This raises a truly important question and points squarely towards uncharted territory, likely beyond the model's current scope. While the convergence holds true if models are primarily focused on mastering human text, because, as some argue, there are only so many abilities needed to predict human language, and larger models simply master narrower, less common aspects of it, the landscape shifts dramatically when we consider powerful AIs that can far exceed human capabilities.
AIs that go beyond human knowledge.
Potentially, yes. These AIs could learn entirely new kinds of skills, not just better human imitation. Think about techniques like reinforcement learning, where AIs learn through trial and error in complex environments.
Like AlphaGo learning to play Go.
Exactly. AlphaGo learned to play Go better than any human, not by reading Go books, but by playing against itself millions of times. That's a different kind of learning. And consider the increasing use of synthetic data, where AIs generate their own training data rather than relying solely on human-created data sets. This promises to drastically change the data distributions AIs are trained on. This shifts the focus from how well AIs are learning human-derived patterns to what they are learning, and whether that learning involves fundamentally new knowledge acquisition or even discovery.
So learning things humans don't even know.
That's the frontier. Imagine an AI designing new molecules for drug discovery, not by reading chemistry textbooks, but by running billions of virtual experiments and learning from the outcomes. That's a completely different learning paradigm. It's a frontier where these convergence laws, based on mimicking a fixed data distribution, might simply not apply in the same way. Or maybe new forms of loss functions might emerge that don't immediately converge. The paper itself expresses uncertainty about its model's applicability in these new cases, where AIs are trained on adaptively chosen data or their own synthetic data. It's a frontier where the rules of the game might change entirely.
You mentioned earlier that sometimes a tiny loss difference, a seemingly insignificant technical gap, might have a huge real-world impact. Can you give us an example where that exponentially small difference truly matters, perhaps in a high-stakes scenario?
Absolutely. The paper points out that even exponentially small differences in overall loss may correspond to surprisingly large capability differentials, especially in specific critical domains. For example, to accurately model the relatively small set of tokens dealing with elementary math, a model has to internalize the entire rules of arithmetic.
Right, math needs precision.
Exactly. A tiny loss difference might mean the difference between getting 99.9% of math problems correct and 100%. That's a seemingly small numerical difference in loss, but it's a vast difference in reliability and trust for practical applications like financial modeling, engineering design, or medical diagnostics, where even a minute error could be catastrophic. This is particularly relevant in adversarial settings or competitive games, where agents are actively incentivized to find situations where the competitor is unfamiliar or weak.
Like trying to exploit a tiny flaw.
Precisely. In such scenarios, adversaries with exponentially increasing compute might continuously diverge from their competitors, because even small performance differences can greatly impact win rates. Think of high-stakes competitive games like chess or Go, where a minute advantage in understanding or prediction can translate into a decisive victory. Or consider a cybersecurity scenario, where one AI might be infinitesimally better at predicting vulnerabilities, allowing it to consistently outmaneuver an opponent.
So the gap might matter hugely in competition.
It could. However, the paper also notes that even in these competitive games, diminishing returns may eventually reappear at very high levels of compute as agents approach theoretically perfect play. There might be fundamental limits, so the advantage might not be infinite, but it could be long-lasting and incredibly significant in certain contexts, especially competitive ones.
This whole idea of Meek models eventually becoming powerful has truly profound implications for how we manage and govern AI. If these systems are going to become widely accessible, what's that mean for our current window of opportunity to put effective governance in place? Is there a period where large, centralized entities still have an advantage that we, as a society, should maybe leverage for safety?
The model points to exactly that, a crucial concept they called the governance window. This is conceptualized as a finite period during which large, centralized entities do have a significant advantage in terms of AI capabilities over more ubiquitous, widely accessible AI models.
Okay, a temporary advantage for the big players.
Yes, and during this time, regulations can potentially be more targeted and focused on a smaller number of powerful actors. This period is particularly advantageous because trusted organizations, presumably with superior resources during this window, have a chance to gain invaluable experience with these powerful models. And, crucially, they can use that time to design and test safety procedures before these systems become widely accessible to potentially malicious actors or just the general public without proper safeguards.
So it's a chance to get ahead of the curve on safety.
Exactly. It's a unique, maybe finite, opportunity to build the guardrails, similar perhaps to how safety protocols for nuclear power were developed before the technology became globally dispersed.
But this sounds like a double-edged sword, right?
Yeah.
A governance window offers an opportunity for safety development, but it also concentrates power, which brings its own set of concerns.
It absolutely is a double-edged sword. You've hit the nail on the head. While it provides a vital window for focused safety development and risk mitigation, it simultaneously creates a period where a small number of groups, be they corporations or state actors, could accumulate disproportionate power and influence through their exclusive access to frontier AI. This concentration of power carries its own set of risks, including the potential for misuse or for the powerful entities to dictate the terms of AI development and deployment without sufficient public oversight or democratic input. It's a really delicate balance.
Leveraging a temporary advantage for safety versus guarding against the potential for unchecked power. Tricky.
Very tricky.
This leads to an interesting, almost counterintuitive question then. Does spending more money on AI, rapidly accelerating its development, actually help with safety rather than hindering it if it's done by the right organizations?
That's a really thought-provoking question posed by this framework. If the benefits of centralization and effectively using this governance window are considered strong enough, then accelerating AI development, particularly by well-intentioned and responsible organizations, might indeed have a net positive effect on safety. As one of the figures in the paper illustrates, if a safe, trusted organization makes a very large investment in AI, they will gain access to highly capable systems much earlier than consumers or less resourced actors.
Giving them a head start on safety research.
Exactly. This gives that specific organization significantly more time, potentially years, to conduct critical safety research, develop robust alignment techniques, figure out monitoring, and put fail-safes in place before these powerful systems become ubiquitous and potentially harder to control once they're out in the wild. It's essentially an argument for centralizing initial development under responsible actors to create a safety buffer, buying society more time to adapt to these powerful technologies.
Okay, that's a complex argument with significant implications. Now, for companies or even countries, a big competitive advantage has always been seen as having the most capital to build proprietary models, creating a money moat around their AI capabilities, keeping competitors out. Does this paper suggest that money isn't the long-term moat in AI, that eventually even the biggest spenders won't have a lasting advantage based purely on compute?
That's absolutely a key takeaway for our listener, and it's truly transformative for how we think about competitive dynamics in AI. The paper makes a compelling argument that even drastic differences in compute investment, think billions versus thousands, will ultimately lead to only a modest and likely transient difference in important capability measures like loss or benchmark scores. It strongly suggests that in the long run, under the current scaling paradigm at least, no entity can hope to maintain a large, insurmountable advantage simply by outspending others on raw compute power.
So the moat isn't made of money, or at least not just money.
Right. This has profound implications for businesses. It means their long-term competitive edge might need to come from innovation and application, from unique or proprietary data sets, from superior user experience, or from their ability to integrate AI seamlessly into products and workflows rather than just having the biggest raw model. And for national AI strategies, it implies that purely outspending rivals on compute might not guarantee a lasting lead in frontier AI capabilities. The focus might need to shift towards other strategic assets like talent development, unique data access, or creating effective regulatory frameworks that foster responsible innovation.
If these trends continue, it really sounds like high-performance deep learning models could become as common as, say, computer ownership or internet access. That's a monumental shift in the distribution of powerful technology, maybe one of the biggest in history.
It certainly does suggest that potential future. A future where a large fraction of the world's population could eventually have widespread access to powerful deep learning models, much like the ubiquity of personal computers or smartphones today. This implies a significant dispersion of power to individuals and smaller groups. It allows them to share broadly in the benefits and productivity increases that improved AI might bring.
It's quite the vision.
Imagine individuals having access to personalized, highly capable tutors, advanced research assistants that can synthesize complex information instantly, or sophisticated creative tools that currently only large corporations can afford. It's a truly democratizing vision for technology, potentially empowering individual agency on an unprecedented scale.
That sounds incredibly exciting, promising widespread innovation and empowerment for so many people. But
It also sounds potentially risky. If powerful AI becomes widely accessible, what are the safety implications, especially considering capabilities that might be dual use or even inherently dangerous?
Indeed. That widespread accessibility, while potentially wonderfully democratizing, also poses a significant safety risk. That's the other side of the coin. If individuals or small, perhaps malicious groups gain access to dangerous capabilities like advanced tools for designing novel bioweapons, or for creating highly persuasive, targeted disinformation at scale, or even for automating sophisticated cyber attacks, the potential for harm dramatically increases.
Things that are currently hard to do become easy.
Potentially, yes. Currently, such capabilities might be limited, we hope, to state actors or large organizations that can theoretically be monitored and held accountable. In a world of ubiquitous, powerful AI, the challenge of preventing misuse becomes far more complex and dispersed. It's much harder to track millions of individual users than a few large labs. This is why the governance discussion becomes so urgent and critical. We must consider not just the immense benefits, but also the amplified risks of widespread access to potent technology.
That leads directly to how we regulate AI then. So much of current AI governance, like the U.S. export controls on certain GPU hardware or the EU's focus on models trained above specific FLOPS thresholds, concentrates on monitoring and limiting access to these enormous frontier systems. Is that entire approach still going to be effective in this Meek models inherit the Earth future, where powerful capabilities are no longer just locked inside giant data centers?
Our sources strongly indicate that simply restricting total compute or focusing regulatory efforts solely on the largest models and the companies that build them may not be sufficient to prevent frontier AI capabilities from becoming ubiquitous in the long run. If advanced AI becomes widely accessible through these Meek models, models that can achieve SOTA performance with relatively modest resources and be run on widely available hardware, then the current regulatory focus on large centralized systems will inevitably miss a significant and growing part of the picture.
It's like trying to regulate the internet by only watching the backbone providers.
That's a great analogy. You ignore all the individual websites and users creating and sharing content. The approach becomes outdated almost as soon as it's implemented if the underlying technical dynamics shift, as predicted by this paper. It presents a fundamental challenge to current policy thinking.
So what's the alternative? How do we effectively regulate AI in a world where powerful models are potentially everywhere, distributed, and accessible even to individuals? What new targets or strategies would governance need to adopt to remain relevant and effective?
That's the billion-dollar question, isn't it? Future AI governance will likely need to fundamentally rethink its approach. One path is that it would need to drastically increase its capacity for monitoring and safeguarding all AI systems, regardless of their training budget or the size of the entity operating them. That would be an enormous, perhaps practically impossible task to scale globally, raising huge privacy concerns, too.
Seems infeasible. What's the other option?
The other option is that governance must find entirely new targets for effective regulation, moving beyond compute thresholds. This could include focusing on regulating the data used for training AI rather than the compute power, or regulating the algorithms themselves, perhaps identifying and restricting certain types of dangerous algorithms, or algorithms with specific hazardous capabilities, or even focusing on new research breakthroughs that unlock particularly hazardous capabilities, trying to govern the science itself, as some have suggested.
Moving upstream in the development process.
Exactly. It's about moving beyond just counting transistors or petaflops and looking at the foundational elements of AI development, or perhaps shifting the focus more towards regulating the applications and uses of AI, rather than just its raw power or the size of the company that built the initial model. It's a necessary shift from controlling the faucet to somehow managing the widespread flow.
And that brings us towards the end of this deep dive. What a journey it's been, really fundamentally reshaping how we might think about AI's trajectory. Let's just quickly recap the central thesis. Despite the current dominance and seemingly unstoppable growth of massive AI models, the inherent diminishing returns to scale strongly suggest a future where even Meek models, those trained to run with limited computation budgets, will approach and eventually converge with the performance levels of the very best, most expensive models.
And this convergence implies a profoundly decentralized future, potentially a world where frontier AI capabilities become ubiquitously accessible, shifting power from the few to the many. While this promises widespread benefits and unprecedented democratization of advanced technology, it also carries significant new risks that society must confront and plan for.
And that's really our call to action for governance, isn't it? We need to stress the urgency for policymakers, for researchers, for society as a whole to adapt. The field is changing so rapidly, and new technical methods are constantly emerging. Regardless of the exact timeline or mechanisms, we simply must prepare by developing AI governance methods that can actually be effective in such a world where the Meek models might truly inherit the earth. So here's a final thought to leave you with. If the very essence of AI power becomes democratized, not just available to the few, but truly accessible to the many, what new forms of human creativity, collaboration, and indeed challenge will we truly unlock? That's something profound for all of us to ponder. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.